All right, first things first, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Comprehensive Tactical Athlete System Clinic on fueling the body. This particular block of instruction or lesson is going to pertain to the pillar of performance nutrition, as you see up here on the screen, right? It's one of our 8 pillars of the Comprehensive Tactical Athlete System. And this one in particular, unlike the physical readiness training program, Army body composition program, and our injury rehabilitation program, this one is more of a supplementary program. That's because programs need to be established in a way where you have some type of foundational baseline and then some type of practical action that can help an individual kind of progress, and then some type of assessment along the way to track their progress. Otherwise, it's very difficult for something to be a complete program. With regards to, yes, Sergeant Major. Go ahead, CSM. That's just the echo on theirs. All right, that's fine. So with regards to nutrition, that's something that's very hard to track and consistently assess, because how would we track progress with our ability to manage our dietary intake? What do you think?
I think it's hard for one to start, but there's, I think Under Armour got some apps that let you track what you eat, and it give you the macros of the stuff that you're eating and the intake. And you can scan, like if you go to Subway for a sample, you can just scan the menu and it give you like whatever you're eating and it record it. So you can create a plan and know monthly what your intake is.
Absolutely. So there are applications. Thank you for that. There are absolutely applications out there. There's a plethora of them out now that allow you to either scan barcodes or physically enter the food that you're eating into whatever database they have to be able to accurately track your dietary intake, or to some degree of accuracy at least, right? To track what you're putting in your body. But how do we assess progress with regards to that dietary intake within ourselves?
I think when it comes to fueling the body, it's more about what lifestyle you get more. Like if you're more like, if you're sitting in a desk all day, you don't work out or anything like that, then maybe the type of food you eat will be different to someone that actually do PT in the morning, work, and then maybe do PT in the afternoon.
Okay.
If you do weights, if you do more cardio, it's all different. So it's, you need a different type of fuel in your lifestyle. So maybe that's a start.
So you're absolutely right. You're both right. In this case, you're talking about how to optimize nutrient intake at certain intervals depending on your activity in the day, right? And in certain compositions depending on what activity you're doing, right? So you're right. Not hitting the perfect point I'm getting to yet.
I think we might measure our bodies as far as, I guess we would do that as far as checking our weight.
Okay.
Or taping our bodies. Yeah.
Good. So track when we modify our dietary intake, we're typically doing it for several reasons, right? One would be our general health, right? We want to make sure that we are as healthy as we can be. 2 would be for our composition. We either want to look better or, pass certain occupational metrics. Now, 3rd would be performance, which would involve not only the composition, but the timing of the nutrient intake. But when we look at the numbers of the food that we're actually intaking and what that food is, just tracking those numbers alone doesn't provide us an accurate assessment of what's happening, right? We have to use some type of secondary assessment, being body composition, being performance, in order to measure this. So that brings me to why the performance nutrition program is a supplementary program to everything else that we're teaching, rather than just a straightforward program like physical training would be, which is, this is how strong you are, this is how fast you are, this is what you can do to get stronger or faster, and then did you get stronger or faster? Does everyone see that correlation? The other supplementary program we have is our resilience readiness program within CTAS. And that one, interestingly enough, supplements everything, including performance nutrition. Why do you think teaching resiliency supplements performance nutrition?
I think the resilient part is, like I say, because it's more come with discipline.
Mm.
So the understanding of it's not going to just change overnight or the mentality change. I guess the resilient part is to just, if you're trying to accomplish the goal, just stay on your goal path.
Okay, good. So when it comes to consistency and the willpower?
It goes back to that saying like you.
Ah, yes.
So implementing like a resiliency is also to keep it, like I said, a discipline lifestyle.
Okay, so consistency is a big piece of this, and that is huge with regards to resiliency. Resiliency in general, especially in the military, it's based off of psychology, right? How do we look at the human mind and its behaviors? And then as leaders, how do we not only understand our soldiers' behaviors, but how do we better condition our soldiers' behaviors to make them more resilient? And that's particularly true with nutrition because it all comes back to habits. I can provide you the perfect number to help you reach your goal after a few conversations and assessments. And you can do that quite similarly with your soldiers. As Sergeant Gomez mentioned earlier, you can download an app and your soldiers can download an app right now. They can put in at least their base measurements, right, of height and weight and age and biological sex. And they'll see some type of, 4-digit number on the screen that says this is what you need to hit in order to hit some type of arbitrary goal, okay? But what that doesn't do is teach that soldier, that individual, how do you establish positive behaviors with regards to your dietary intake. That doesn't teach them how do you look at hunger and what is hunger. How do you react to that feeling that you're going to have throughout the day? Right? How does that food that you're eating differ if you're going to be cycling today versus running versus lifting weights? And does it matter, right? Which is Sergeant Rivera's point earlier. So with regards to resiliency, we need to understand that every single time we're looking at one of these variables with regards to CTAS and the holistic health and fitness system, is that they're all intertwined. They're all synergistic. We really can't separate one from the other. At a base level, even if you are teaching your soldiers nutrition, if you're doing so in a way where you're trying to help modify their behaviors and their understanding, you're also implementing different aspects of leadership, right? So it all supplements a leadership development program that we're also establishing. Good. So within PNP, right, the performance nutrition program, an easy doctrinal guideline that you have to be able to help your soldiers, if you just wanted to provide them something that is already Army-based and black and white, would be Chapter 8 of the new FM7-22. Right? You see there, it's only pages 83 to 99, so it's not that many pages. And within that page scope, it actually goes through basic nutrition, it goes through performance nutrition, nutrient timing, as well as nutrient intake in order to recover from injury. Because if you wanted to eat to look good versus eating to feel good versus eating to perform good, those are all completely different goals and completely different approaches. Eating one way doesn't necessarily optimize you for all of that. So including, like I said before, injury rehabilitation. We talked about how this supplements some of the other programs. And if you haven't read Executive Order 17-22, which just came out in January, that covers the Army's new approach, especially for our feeding detachments throughout the Army, of how we need to be able to implement H2F, which is what we're doing here with CTAS, with regards to nutrition. So that gives all guidelines toward any 92 golf, any dining facility, and toward leaders on how to approach nutrition for their soldiers. Any questions so far? All right, good. So the way you start any type of programming, whether it's physical programming, whether we're looking at retraining the mind, is you have to know where you are, right? So how do you find out where you are?
An assessment.
Perfect, an assessment. It's performing some form of a needs analysis. So needs analysis with regards to dietary intake would comprise of what? What type of variables?
Have a start, a set one, and then check it again a couple of months later, or weeks later. Have a basis, and then simply science experience. Control environment.
All right, good. You're absolutely right. So whenever you're performing a needs analysis, you should always plan for some type of reassessment in order to track progress and evaluate if what you're doing works, right? That is always, always, always needed. But if we were going to assess your dietary practices right now, what information would we be looking at in order to assess your dietary practices?
As far as in what you eat, what you eat and how much you, yeah.
Calorie intake.
All right, so we're looking at what we're eating. We're looking at overall energy intake, which is our calorie, and then some followers bringing up the overall macronutrient aspect, right? So we need to be able to look at what we are currently eating, right? That's going to be a little bit longer of assessment. Those are called dietary recalls, and those are generally about a week long for dietary recall. And when we're performing that assessment, though, we need to use that information and make sure we're tracking progress, right? So in order to have progress, we need to have some type of end state. What's another way to think about an end state?
Goal setting.
Our goals, perfect. Which again comes back to resiliency. One of the biggest aspects of MRT is to teach someone how to set a SMART goal, an efficient goal that you can hit, as well as hitting these benchmarks. So with nutrition, usually the SMART goal, as aforementioned, is going to have to revolve either around body composition or some type of performance-based aspect, right? So with food, when we think of fueling the body, the very, very first thing for you and for your soldiers to start to intake with, or start to rephrase and reframe your mind is food should be what for your body? Energy, purely energy. We typically look at food as a obligation, right? It is breakfast time, it is lunchtime, it is dinner time, and or we look at food as a celebratory thing. Someone is coming to visit, where are we going to go eat, right? It is someone's birthday, it is, someone's retiring, whatever it is, where's the cake, right? It's an organizational day. We are going to, one, get out of uniform, right? So we can be in civilians. So we try and release certain obligations. Then we try and celebrate by doing something like a potluck or bringing in the type of food. And I'm not here to try and dissuade enjoying food whatsoever. I certainly enjoy food, but the first part of the behavioral aspect is understanding that food is at its very base level, purely energy for the body. So then we need to know our energy needs in order to meet our goal. Does that make sense? All right. So when we look at how do we quantify energy for food, at least? Calories, perfect. And through international, if you look at any type of studies, that'll consider a kilocalorie, right? It'll just put a K in front of that. In the US, we interchange the word calorie and kilocalorie, but it's exact same thing for all of other measurements. But calories are just a measurement of energy from within that food. The hard part and the sad part, and this is why it's very important to start this way, is that most of your soldiers have no idea what the demand of their body for energy is. They don't even know what that number is to start. So sometimes, even if they're well-intentioned, they'll try and go on some type of temporary diet. They'll start looking at certain foods as, suboptimal for what they want. It'll be, this food is bad, this food is good. And they'll start changing their dietary practices without ever even knowing the number that they truly need to hit. Okay, so how do you find that number?
Like you mentioned earlier, these days there's so many apps and websites where you can go in based on your weight, height, and age.
Good. You're absolutely right. So there's a lot of apps right there right now, and there's a lot of websites you can go to that have calculators automatically built in. And we can start with that. And that's a really good location, or that's a really good point to be able to at least pull your soldiers in. But what I would challenge you to do when you implement something like that, you give them the equation, is also to provide the purpose behind it. Because if they look at this number and they don't inherently understand why this number is the way it is, then this temporary state that they're typically getting into in order to reform a number on a scale, potentially, they may not stay in that long term because they haven't established any type of behavior, right? They just saw some type of fleeting number and they may try to, slightly change their intake for now to get to that number. But without the consistency in developing that auto regulation, they're never going to have that long-term pattern, right? So that's what we're going to be going in today, at least for the beginning of this. So the number I'm gonna put up here, let's treat this just like an app, and then let's get into the purpose. So I want everyone to be able to calculate their energy intake based off of the numbers you see on the screen, right? The first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna find your resting energy expenditure, which is your REE. You're gonna find this by inputting or finding the equation for your biological age and biological sex. You're gonna use the equation to the right of that with your current body weight. Once you find that number, you are going to choose one of the 3 primary goals on the bottom left, and then you're going to use the equation to the right of that to calculate your total daily energy expenditure, your TDEE. I'll give you a minute or two to go ahead and find that number. And of course, if you have questions while trying to calculate it, please let me know.
First part, that first formula gives me the REE.
Correct.
That one, then I use, depending on my goal, then I multiply the REE with.
Yes. So as an example, once you find your REE, if your goal was to decrease fat mass, then how do we typically consider that if we were just talking to one another? Someone says they want to do what? Lose some weight. And we'll get to that a little bit later. The idea of losing weight may not be what someone actually wants to do, right? So when we typically talk about losing weight, what they mean, whether they understand it or not, is decrease fat mass. So you take the REE, multiply it times 1.3, and then multiply that again times 0.85 to find your approximate TDEE. For your goal would be 2,248, Sergeant Rivera? Which goal did you choose? Decrease fat mass.
2,714.
So Sergeant Latney, 2,714. Which goal did you choose?
Increase muscle mass.
All right, so it's about a 500 kilocalorie difference between those on the opposite end of the spectrum. If I may ask, Sergeant Rivera, what is your current weight?
195.
195, and Sergeant Latney?
172.
172. So this is very interesting. So let's look at these numbers. If you'd see someone that would be heavier, what would you think would happen to their energy intake, their energy needs?
You see someone heavier?
Yeah, if you have 2 individuals and one is heavier, what would you expect of their energy requirements, their needs?
And the one that's heavier needs more energy, maybe?
Yeah, the one that's heavier would typically need more energy, right? In this case, we have approximately a 20-pound difference, maybe an 18-pound difference, but a 500 kilocalorie difference. Now, of course, there are different goals, right? One's trying to increase mass and one's trying to decrease mass, at least on lean and fat. But 500 kilocalories per day is a lot. Does anyone know how much energy is within a pound of fat? There's approximately 3,500 kilocalories, so 3,500 calories within a pound of fat. This is generally why, if you look at just rudimentary nutrition and dietary advice, the initial recommendation is if you lower your caloric intake by approximately 500 calories a day, then by the end of the week, you would have lowered 3,500 calories in order to try and get a pound of fat loss a week. Now, in practicality, it doesn't necessarily work that directly because there's a lot of other variables that are involved. But if you just look at thermodynamics alone without anything else, that is true, right? But in this case, we have a lighter individual with 500 calories more when they're trying to increase muscle mass. Good. Any other questions on their calculations for what you found so far? Go ahead, Sergeant Coley.
Once we got to our actual number, that number we have, what are we doing with that number?
What are we doing with that number? That is the key to all of this. That's a phenomenal question. Phenomenal question. So to answer that question, let's take a step back and look at the number that you calculated first before you got your TDEE. Your REE, your resting energy expenditure, what does that signify?
It's the amount of energy the body uses. Not even
Perfect. So if you still have your REE number available,
that's the energy body needs to work, period.
correct. So if you still have that REE number available, I know some of you did the calculation on your cell phone, you just used it to get to the next number. So you may not have written it down and saved it, and that's fine. But if you calculate your REE, that is telling you right now, as far as an assessment, that is the approximate amount of energy your body needs just to survive at your current body weight. And that is typically a surprising number for a lot of individuals when they think about wanting to go on some type of diet, right? If you just look at that number alone, if you did nothing, you just woke up, you didn't walk the dogs, you didn't go up and down stairs, you didn't do any housework, you didn't work out, that number is how many calories, how much energy your body is going to expend just to survive with your current mass, which I think is quite interesting. Now, once you start introducing movement, what you're introducing is called NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So everything you do, such as walking upstairs versus taking an escalator or an elevator, parking further away to walk, mowing the lawn, doing housework, all of the normal movement you do that is not considered exercise falls under NEAT. That comprises, outside of just your normal biological processes to survive, that comprises of the majority of your caloric expenditure in a day, even if you go and you exercise. Exercise itself has very, 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 very little to do with actual fat loss and caloric expenditure, which is what we typically synergize it with, right? That's a common misconception. A lot of people think, oh, I need to go work out in order to lose weight. It certainly helps when you exercise to, when you're going to lose weight, because you are increasing your caloric expenditure some, but it's so minuscule compared to the normal movements that you do that it's almost irrelevant. What you're doing when you train is you're telling your body how to use the nutrients that you're consuming. So you start changing the blueprint that your body is using that energy for. If you're sedentary, you're telling your body to be better at doing what? At being sedentary.
Yeah.
If you don't get up much, your body's going to be better at not getting up much. It doesn't have a moral compass. It doesn't look at it as good or bad, right? Whatever you do constantly, your body's going to start utilizing its energy intake and resources in order to get better at that. So if you're lifting heavy weights, it starts modifying its energy to get better at lifting heavy weight. If you're running more, it starts modifying its energy to start increasing your ability to run, or with whatever running form you're doing, right? And there's another conversation whether that form is efficient or inefficient. But back, at least on the nutritional part, when we start thinking about these as behaviors, and we start thinking of adaptations, the nutrient intake and the consistency of that, which was starting Coley brought up earlier, is the most critical piece. Exercise just helps expedite how our body's going to use it. So if you want your body to start getting rid of fat, you need to start introducing movement that tells your body fat mass is not important. What type of exercise is the best at telling your body that fat mass is not important? Lifting weights, external resistance, producing a lot of force, because that requires your musculoskeletal system. So what it does is it prioritizes the energy to repairing and uptaking your musculoskeletal system through protein synthesis and a variety of other biological means. And therefore, the body can't necessarily focus on lipogenesis, which is the creation of fat tissue, because it can only do one or the other. Cardiovascular training, although it expends a significant amount of calories compared to resistance training, that tells your body to either hold on to or to store more fat, which I know it seems contradictory because a lot of runners seem very skinny. That's typically because you have to look at the total picture of what they are doing, right? You have to look at how many calories are they expending, how often are they typically moving, and what are they eating. It's not that running and cardiovascular makes you lose weight faster. That's not necessarily the case. It's just that most people that are in the habit of running a lot also have other behaviors that make them leaner, or at least skinnier, right? Not necessarily lean through muscle mass, right? So we have to see how we're take a step back and look at those correlations. So running itself is actually contradictory to trying to modify your body composition, at least in an optimal way, right? It's not that if you want to lose weight, you should never run, but the majority of your training should be resistance training. Questions on that so far? Wonderful. So this ties us into Sergeant Coley's question and the most critical question of what do we do with this number once we have it? So when we look at this number, we look at our total energy intake. How can we further break our energy intake down into the components we're actually consuming throughout the day? We have calories. Those calories are going to come from what? Yes, what we eat, but let's break that down into a term. Sergeant Fowler brought it up earlier. Calories are comprised of your macronutrients. Your macronutrients are your energy yielding nutrients. So your micronutrients are your non-energy yielding nutrients. What are micronutrients? Perfect. Vitamins and minerals. So your vitamins and minerals of, you have your A, various forms of B, K, D, E, etc. All of these help supplement different chemical processes throughout our body, right, in order to repair, such as you have fat soluble and water soluble vitamins. Does anyone know what your fat soluble vitamins are? There's 4 of them. Fat soluble vitamins, meaning that it requires fat in order to go through its chemical process. Vitamin B is not one, but I'm glad you guessed. It's never bad to be wrong. All right, so vitamins A, D, E, and K, ADEC, are your only fat soluble vitamins, which means if you don't have a decent intake of fat, especially some optimal fats in your diet, your body cannot use those vitamins efficiently. Vitamin A pertains a lot to your vision and the repair of your eyes, right? Your eyes, just like every other structure in your body, go through consistent cellular breakdown, and it constantly goes through, the production of new cells. All of our cells are constantly dying, dividing, and replicating, right? And as they're going through that, they can degenerate over time, which we typically consider aging. But in order to help the constant repair of that process, this is where vitamins and minerals come in. So A helps for vision. D helps for a lot of your bone growth, right? So your bones are living tissue. They actually replace themselves within a 7-year period. And the amount of stress that you put on your bones through contracting your muscles tell them how strong they need to be, which is also why resistance training is of paramount importance, because the only way you can produce optimal force, at least ergonomically, without introducing excess strain, is with weights. Yeah, Sergeant Fowler.
The gas, because I have like a type of condition that that my body does not absorb well, I think, the vitamin B. So when they do the exam, it's very high. So that's what I thought maybe doesn't,
That's another interesting point we can get to with regards to both the genetic disposition, utilization of these minerals, these vitamins and minerals, versus recommendations. If you look at base dietary recommended intake, DRI, if you just searched for what you need online, right? Or if you look at a multivitamin pack, you buy some multivitamins at a store and you look at the back and it says there's 100% of this or 66% of this. Well, every single one of you, and myself included, and every single one of our soldiers are going to have different needs based off of their compositions, based off of their activities, so that 66% isn't 66% for everybody. Right? So we need to be able to ensure our soldiers understand that what they're intaking may not be useful for them at all. It may be a waste of money, or for them, it may be crucial to be able to consume that type of thing, right? In your case, and it depends on which vitamin B that your body's not uptaking more. B12, right? So because B is broken down into a variety of aspects. So B12, when it comes to riboflavin, is usually considered one of your micronutrients that modifies your ability to manipulate energy within your body. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions with this as well. So when people think they're taking like a B12 shot or like an energy drink, right? If that energy drink has 0 calories, how much energy is in that energy drink?
0.
Nothing, right? So vitamin B in and of itself doesn't provide energy, but what it does is it acts as a catalyst for certain chemical processes in which you derive ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is what is our energy availability, right, for our utilization. So if you have a hard time for your body absorbing vitamin B12, it just means it has a slower energetic process that you would need to manipulate through other means. For you, being more active is going to help your body's consistency with energy manipulation. Where if you had an individual with your same genetics that was inactive, they would be at a more expedited rate of less health or a lower degree of health because now they have lower energy uptake and less activity. Does that make sense? It's a big one with vitamin D as well. If an individual has a vitamin D deficiency, that's quite significant. This happens particularly with individuals that don't get out in sunlight a lot. Vitamin D is one of the few vitamins that we can actually synthesize through sunlight, right? And then we have vitamin E, which is for our skin health, which is extremely important. It's the largest organ on your body. And it's not just for how you look, but our skin is our first form of protection, our integumentary system. So being able to maintain the health and the hydration of our skin and things like that affect everything else. And then vitamin K is actually for your nervous system, right? The ability for your nerves to be able to communicate and how quick they can fire from one to another, which again is important, right? So those 4 fat-soluble vitamins help express when we get to the dietary fat aspect, when people try and cut fat out of their diet. One of the reasons why it's very important to have good, adequate dietary fat, all right? But the ones that pertain to energy for our initial part of our conversation are our macronutrients, right? So protein, carbohydrates, and fat. You see water listed up there as a macronutrient because you need it in large amounts, but of course water doesn't provide energy in and of itself. Any questions on the class of nutrients or the distinction between the 2 primary categories? Good. So when you're actually looking at a label or you're thinking about how these numbers work and what they mean to you, this chart you see here helps break down our understanding of the energy that's within each of these macronutrients. So if you look at a label and it has 10 grams of protein in it, and for whatever reason it had nothing else, just 10 grams of protein, how much energy is within a serving of that item, whatever that is? 40 calories, right? Because there's 4 calories per gram. So you just multiply the number of grams times 4. What do you particularly see with regards to fat versus protein and carbohydrates?
A lot more calories in fat than there is.
There's a lot more. There's more than double. This is actually where individuals tend to overeat. They tend to actually be in what we consider a hypercaloric state. They're consuming in excess, a surplus of energy compared to what their body is actually utilizing. This typically happens with dietary fat because it's very, very, very easy to go over this. Right? So consider this. Your soldier is going to sit around or say your soldier is going to be driving from here to Camp Santiago, Fort Buchanan, Camp Santiago. So they're going to know they're going to be in a vehicle for a while. They know they're going to be at the range for a while, so they buy snacks. Easy snack, non-perishable, mixed nuts. So they buy a can of cashews. If they have a handful of those cashews are primarily fat, right? Most nuts and seeds are primarily fat. That handful of cashews is typically between 180 and 210 calories. Do they stop at that handful?
Like, eat the whole can. Eat the can.
Yes. If you have a can in front of you, that can typically becomes a serving because of the behavioral practices. It's a lack of understanding. If you have someone that eats so let me take a step back. When it comes to psychology, you typically consider something binge eating and a negative behavioral practice of eating when someone's putting another handful or spoonful, forkful, whatever, of food in their mouth before they've even finished swallowing the food that they're already eating, is one. Two, when they're idly consuming food without necessarily there's not necessarily a need for energy. It's a behavioral practice similar to why it's so hard to quit smoking, right? Because you're just trying to fill some type of activity void, right? You're eating a lot of popcorn because you're watching a movie. It's not that you're hungry. It's not that you need the energy. You've just combined those activities together, correct? So when they're consuming this one can of almonds or cashews or mixed nuts, they are likely going over their entire daily energy intake, especially if they're going to be sitting around doing very little for that day. But they also had a breakfast time. They had a lunch time. They had a dinner time in which they felt obligated to consume a meal, regardless of the snack that they had. And now they may be in excess of 3 to 4 times the amount of energy that their body would have needed in that day. And as this as this habit continues consistently, this is where they end up getting into these situations where they are suddenly much heavier and they may not know why, right? They think, yeah, I wasn't really eating as best as I could, and then they have all these negative processes, right? So understanding this aspect, even though a lot of people don't like to do math, and the idea of knowing that fat has a lot more energy in it is very important. It is why the servings of ice cream and servings of cereal and servings of things like peanut butter, which is not a protein, is the what? It's a fat. Good. So servings of these foods are so depressing, right? Servings of peanut butter, a serving size of peanut butter is usually not enough to cover a slice of bread, right? Because it's 2 leveled tablespoons, not, you just reached your knife into that jar about 7 or 8 times to get one of your potential multiple slices of peanut butter, right? So this is where we have to be very cognizant of what we're intaking, and it adds up very quick. The other part that adds up very quick with fat is oils, right? If you have a teaspoon of oil, it's typically 110 to 160 calories in and of itself. This is what makes fast food and a lot of purchased food outside of their house that you're not cooking so heavy in calories, right? You buy a combo at Burger King or McDonald's or Subway or any of these places, any of these locations, that one thing may be 1,100, 1,200, 1,400 calories because of typically the oils that are going to be used in the cooking process. If you ate just for lunch something that was 1,200 calories, what does that look like in comparison to the REE you calculated earlier? It's more than half. Absolutely. This is what we need to be wary of. Any questions so far? Good. So, generally, when people start actually thinking about calories or thinking about weight loss, most people who are not in the exercise science realm, that aren't professional athletes, don't really look at energy from the performance perspective, unfortunately, or at least they don't, per my experience teaching with soldiers and athletes. I can't say that's wholly true for all, but at least anecdotally, most people only look at calories and they think, I want to lose weight. So what we talked about earlier is a pound of fat has approximately 3,500 kilocalories in there. Now, what your soldier needs to understand and what you need to help them understand is the calorie aspect is the most important factor with regards to energy management. Modifying the macros will make more or less processes more or less efficient, right? They may increase their injury repair if they're trying to get off of profile. They may increase their performance by modifying the macronutrient intake. They may affect their daily energy feeling, how energetic they are, whether they're tired or not through their overall macronutrient distribution. But at the end of the day, if they're just focused on the numbers and the scale, what their macros are irrelevant. It matters what their total energy is at the end of the day. So if you help them calculate their TDEE and it comes out to 2,000 kilocalories a day, right? It's typically what you see at the back of a label. Then as long as they consumed that 2,000 or a little bit less, their body is not going to gain weight. It can't through the law of thermodynamics. It can't have more energy than what it was given, right? So the most fundamental and most important rule is always energy in versus energy out. Okay. But when most people are looking at a diet, they typically look at the easy things to think of, right? So don't eat this because it's bad. Don't eat this because it's good. What are some detrimental effects from looking at certain foods are good or bad, as good or bad?
I mean, because I guess you're knocking out some of the nutrients of the actual stuff that you need in certain foods that can provide. So some people, like I said, is they might, oh, well, steaks are bad, but it has a nice size amount of protein within the steak. So, I mean, just justifying it's not really actually the actual food. It's the intake or the size portion that you're in, that you're taking in.
Perfect.
I want to talk about like salts and sugars. Like with activities as far as the Army, like we were just doing this past week when putting up a whole trash tent. Out there in the sun, baking, sweating, doing things like that, but they're not eating those other type of foods that give them those natural salts and natural sugars.
Good.
And the energy they need to expenditure while they're out there putting up this heavy tent. I'm gonna just go drink this water. That's all I'm gonna have.
Electrolytes.
With athletes, they go and drink Gatorades or Powerades because they have all the other little fake nutrients, but it's what the body actually needs in order to keep them moving forward. So those are the
Perfect. Excellent. So it's understanding the intent. Why are you consuming what you're consuming? How is this useful for you? Because the general advice that people get are don't eat fast food, lower your sugars, lower your fat, lower your salt. When people think of lowering fat, they think of lowering fast food, they think about lowering fried food, and they think about getting rid of red meat. But that doesn't always correlate. Those are easy and quick pieces of advice to give, and they're not inherently wrong, but it leaves a lot out. And when we hit something with that reductionist hammer, we just need to be very careful, especially as leaders, right? Because you're coming from a position of authority. And from a position of authority, if you tell your soldiers, especially if they believe you and trust in you, which hopefully they do, if you're telling them that salt is bad for you, then they may go to the excess of trying to stay away from salt. And if they're out there profusely sweating because they live in the Caribbean and they're outside doing work, not consuming salt is extremely detrimental to their body, right? It's one of your primary electrolytes that actually help your muscles move and help your nerves kind of interact with one another, right? So it's not that they need to cut out salt, they need to cut out excess salt in their diet. And their daily habits are going to change the need of salt. So we need to be very careful with regards to how we give out quick, short advice, even if it's well-intentioned. And I've been, I'll say, victim to this as well. I mean, I've even responded to PHAs with doctors, which is it's a whole nother soapbox I can get on. But PHAs with doctors who have looked at my blood panels and said, everything looks great, right? Everything is within line what it needs to be. At those times, my body composition, maybe 7 or 8% body fat, performance as well as it can be. And the doctor looks at all this and says, have you thought about cutting out like sodas and salt from your diet? Without ever asking me what my dietary intake is. It's like, one, right? So the baseline of an individual doing that, and it's not just my anecdotal experience for that within myself, because I hear this a lot from different physicians, and I'm not trying to put physicians in some type of negative light, but I hear this a lot from people that talk to their physicians that are giving this advice: just cut out salt immediately from your diet without knowing how much salt that person's intaking, right? For me, I don't drink sodas. I haven't drank soda since maybe like 1999, right? So trying to tell me to cut it out from my diet is irrelevant, right? But when you tell people to do something like that without finding out more about them, you can potentially set them up for a negative behavioral pattern because you may be ruining their relationship with food. So we have to be very careful with that. So for those of you who have heard me teach nutrition before, something I'm a huge advocate of when it comes to the behavior aspect is making sure your soldiers don't look at any food as bad or good. It's not that an apple is good for you or that fruits and vegetables in general are good for you. It's that they have certain micro and macronutrients that may be more beneficial to you in this time. It's a cost-benefit analysis, right? If I'm going to be spending money and spending time and spending the amount of energy in order to consume this item, is it beneficial to what I need? Most of the time for fruits and vegetables, it is. It absolutely is, right? But you can get in excess of that. What's an example of having an excess of fruit that people often don't consider that could potentially be detrimental to their goals?
Like fiber, so you constantly going to the bathroom, so you're not really actually holding any of the weight. I guess flushing the system of the nutrients you might need.
Okay, so if they have too much insoluble fiber in their diet, which may be modifying their gut health, that's one piece. Okay. Too much citrus? Well, that's a piece, right? Whether on boat or not, and the idea of it being on a boat is because when you can modify your vitamin C intake, right? When you're out in sea for a long period of time, and most fruits and vegetables have a high amount of vitamin C, especially dark leafy vegetables have a much more vitamin C than citrus fruits, but citrus fruits will hold for a lot longer, right? So those help get rid of vitamin C deficiencies, but most people don't have a vitamin C deficiency either, right? That's actually why salt was added into a lot of foods. Iodized salt was added to a lot of foods back in the day, whereas because of deficiency in salt and different vitamin C deficiencies to be able to help with that. But again, if you don't know why it was added and what's in your food and what you need, you can't make good choices, so then you have detrimental effects, right? So Delegage brought up maybe too much potassium. When we comes back to those fat-soluble vitamins you talked about before, A, D, and E, and K, potassium falling under that K aspect, you can have too much of a fat-soluble vitamin. Your water-soluble vitamins, you can't have too much of, right? You can have 5,000% of vitamin C. Anything you don't use, your kidneys will flush out through your urine. But fat-soluble vitamins, if you have too much, those can become detrimental to your heart. This is actually what makes dialysis so important for people that have renal failure, right? Kidney failure. If someone has kidney failure, they're unable to, because your kidneys filter 20% of your blood at every point in time. While they're trying to filter these nutrients, they can't filter these fat-soluble vitamins. And as they build up in your system too much, it can cause you to go into immediate, it'll cause arrhythmia and cause certain type of cardiovascular failures, if not death, right? So you can have too much for your vitamins. But for the original point that I was getting to with regards to the good and the bad is we want to make sure our soldiers don't change their behavior so they don't feel guilty when they eat certain foods, and they don't feel that they need to earn or deserve certain foods. With regards to the fruit piece, if you see people that think fruit are healthy, they typically go and look for smoothies. Think, well, fruit's healthy. This is all natural. It's organic. There's nothing wrong with it. And they'll go get a smoothie. But in that smoothie, in order for it to be of substance and to taste good, usually there's some type of sugar or artificial sweetener. And those aren't inherently bad for you, but again, in excess. And then there's maybe about 5 to 6 different fruits in there. When in a sitting, most individuals aren't going to eat a banana, 3 oranges, and like half a pineapple, right? But in that smoothie, they will. And that smoothie is usually a side to whatever they're eating. So when we look at foods as good or bad, it's not only detrimental in general for the behavioral practices, but it's also erroneous. It's the excess of certain foods or the lack completely of certain foods that could be beneficial or negative to your overall health and diet. Any questions on that concept, on those concepts? All right, so with that, when people go on a diet right now, they look at macronutrients and typically think certain macronutrients are good, certain macronutrients are bad. In the 50s and the 70s, it was fat, right? Fat is absolutely bad for you, so they cut a lot of fat from food. And then when they started making fat-free food, they started adding what? So it would actually taste good. Nope. When you have, say, peanut butter is primarily fat, right? If they take out fat from peanut butter, what are they adding into it so it actually tastes good? Sugar. So usually when we go through these trends, if you watch the commercial market, when the normal, populace thinks fat is bad, you'll see a huge uptake in sugar in foods. And then when people see sugar as bad, you'll see that flip-flop and it'll go back to necessarily fat. Now, since we're advancing in a lot of aspects of science, we're getting away from a lot of the fat being added back in, or kept in rather, and now we're going toward artificial sweeteners instead of other forms of sugar, because your body doesn't react or have the same insulin response with artificial sweeteners as it does with sugar. But the idea is we go through these cyclical processes where people think, oh, I need to cut all carbs from my diet, and they even celebrate it. I have so many people that will look at me as an expert with nutrition because I've taught it for so long, and they'll come up to me and so happy that, you'll be so happy with me, Sergeant Rice. I haven't had any carbs in like 2 weeks. And it's good, but also heartbreaking to hear. It's good in the sense that they're being more cognizant of their diet. And the last thing I want to do behaviorally then is to return to them. And what I don't want you to do either is return to them and say, well, you don't need to do that. Because they chose to come to me to share something they found was positive. So from the resiliency and the psychological aspect, the last thing I want to do if I'm trying to enforce good behaviors is to make them feel like their decision was a bad one. I want to reinforce them coming to me. So I say this and it seems like an aside, but you want to take any time they're coming to you, you want to reinforce that behavior by, thanking them for that, being able to show some form of a gratitude for them coming to you to talk to you, because that's very important, and you always want that to happen. You want to take that knowledge in, though, as an assessment as their leader in order to kind of think about when is a time I can potentially set them aside or bring them together as a group so they don't feel like they're being isolated and feel defensive, and cover proper dietary intake so they can reconsider their choices. So everyone see the dichotomy between those choices or those actions? So instead of me saying that it's okay, you should eat rice, it's okay, you can have it back when they enjoy rice. Instead, I'm thinking, I've heard this from several people, maybe I need to have a class on nutrition and kind of talk about why it's okay to eat carbs. Right? So they're not singled out, they can come to the decision on their own, and we reinforce behaviors as we go through. Good. Questions on that? Nutrition coaching, just like being a leader in general, requires a lot of patience and attention to detail. Understanding what motivates the soldier and why they're making the decisions that they're making. So right now, and I bring that up because right now, what is typically seen as bad in diets? Carbs. Most people right now think they want to cut carbs from their diet. And then marketing with food is huge with this. And the unfortunate thing is that nutrition isn't really taught in general education or in the household. So most people don't know anything about nutrition. So they're ignorant, and they're going up against multi-trillion-dollar industries to try and tell them what they should and shouldn't eat. So those soldiers, as individuals in general, are already at a disadvantage when it comes to a type of war between their knowledge and the knowledge of what's being placed against them. So carbohydrates are actually your body's main source of energy. If you're going to do any activity in the day, if you're going to run, you're going to bike, you're going to swim, lift weights, etc., just survive. Your body needs carbs. It's what your body's going to go to when it needs it. In fact, your brain, your entire cognitive process only runs on carbohydrates. It's not going to run on fat and run on protein. So carbohydrates themselves are broken down into those three categories that you see, through those three subtypes, which are complex, simple, and refined. Can someone give me an example of a complex carbohydrate? Having no idea is a perfect answer. So if you don't know an example, what do you think is the difference between a complex and simple carbohydrate, if you want to hazard a guess?
The complex has a lot more things combined to it. All of it out, so you're trying to figure out.
All right, you have the gist of it, right? Within the name, Complex carbohydrates simply have a more complicated and more numerous, when it comes to volume, structure with regards to chemicals or the chemical composition. So carbohydrate, when you look at that name, what it means is there's a carbon molecule and a water molecule, right? Carbohydrate, carbohydrate. So carbohydrates with the carbon and the water molecule, it's basically a hexagon if you look at it chemically. If you have a single chain, one chain of carbohydrates, it's called a monosaccharide, right? A single sugar. Those are typically found in your simple and your refined carbohydrates because there's just one. If you have two, it's considered a disaccharide, right? So now you have two sugar molecules, if you think of the name. Those are also found in simple and refined. When you start to get to 3 or more, you get to polysaccharide, an oligosaccharide, which means there's multiple sugar chains within this, which means it takes your body more energy to process. That's when you start getting into complex carbohydrates. That's what it means for your body. So simple carbohydrates are things that you could go out in nature and find that are naturally sweet. So fruits, sugarcane, honey, milk, those type of things that you can go out and that'd be naturally sweet, unprocessed naturally sweet. Those are simple carbohydrates. It means you have 1 or 2 sugar chains and your body can start breaking it down immediately. Your body starts breaking down simple carbohydrates within your mouth because your saliva is an enzyme called amylase, which is specifically meant to break down single and double chain sugars so it can go immediately into your bloodstream for energy. So with knowing that piece, if you're thinking about performance, you think you're going to be setting up drash tents out in the field, you know you're going to be out on the range, you're going to be going and doing something, and you need to quickly replenish energy, or you need to give yourself energy before an activity. Simple carbohydrates are really good for you because they give your body an increase of energy storage in the short term, and it doesn't tax your digestive system as much because it doesn't take a lot of energy in order to process. Does that make sense? So conversely, complex carbohydrates are things such as grain, oats, which we turn into bread when we think of something processed, or pastas, as well as vegetables. Because the skin on vegetables, because plant cells are different from animal cells, and we are comprised of animal cells, we cannot break down the skin on vegetables. Our body, through mastication, which is our mechanical chewing process to break down food, then the chemical processes, which are enzymes and acids within our digestive system, none of those can break down the plant walls of a plant cell. What do we call in diet those walls of plant cells that we can't use? You said it earlier, Sergeant Lightning. Fiber, perfect. Dietary fiber, that's what that comes into. Fiber is something you cannot digest at all, right? If you think of a cow has how many stomachs? It's 4. And it has 4 stomachs just to be able to take that grass, and basically it has to digest it multiple times to be able to find any type of energy from it. There's only one small chemical change, or change through chemistry rather, composition change between grass and bread. But that one change, right, which we constitute when we look at like that wall of that plant cell, is what prevents us from breaking it down. Now, dietary fiber can be broken down even further into 2 categories, being soluble and insoluble. Soluble fiber, such as oats, if you're going to be eating oatmeal, and a lot of grains that we put into cereal, those turn into a paste within our small intestine, and it slows down our actual movement of food through our digestive tract. So it doesn't become waste. It doesn't go to your large intestine as quickly. This allows your body to pull water back from your food and nutrients back from your food for a longer period of time. Right? So it slows down digestion so you can get more from the nutrients that you're consuming. So that's what soluble fiber is for. It also adds weight to your elimination, to your stool, in order to, because it's sitting in there longer as you're pulling more from it. Right? So you have an individual with relatively ineffective gut issues, they're having diarrhea, etc., excess bowel movements, they need, it's not that they're having too much fiber, it's that they may have too little insoluble fiber in their diet. Does that make sense? Soluble fiber, or excuse me, that was soluble fiber. Insoluble fiber is the opposite. Insoluble fiber is something that comes from like the skin of vegetables, things like corn, or the outside of like zucchini and things of that nature, broccoli, carrots. The outside of those, the skin of the vegetables and that type of insoluble fiber adds weight to the stool, and it makes your digestive processes happen quicker. So your body won't hold on to that food as long. Right? So if you need to be able to move things along quicker in order to make sure it's waste, that's what the insoluble fiber is for. So make sure that we're not always categorizing as both.
Like constipated?
Yes, absolutely. For those that are not having enough bowel movements, right? That'll help get it through quicker. Or if you're even going to go on a mission, right? You're going to be on a mission for a long period of time. You want to make sure that you can kind of clear out your colon a little bit earlier prior to, and then switch over to more soluble fibers, or getting rid of fiber out of your diet altogether while you're on a mission and you're in an austere environment, so you can operate properly without all of that discomfort and things like that. Timing that is important. Same thing with your workouts. You may not want to add insoluble fiber prior to training sessions. Exactly. You don't want to have collard greens before you go squat, right? But afterward, it may be more efficient. So you're seeing how if you just hit fiber with a rudimentary hammer, right? You just say that all fiber is the same, add more fiber, add more fiber, add more fiber. That's not necessarily the correct response. Everyone picking up on putting down? All right. Also, when you look at a label, if something has 50 grams of carbohydrates and 25 grams of dietary fiber, how much of that carbohydrate is your body retrieving energy from?
25 is a half.
Half, 25. So this is where we get the term net carbs from. Because your body cannot use carbohydrate, or excuse me, because your body cannot use fiber in its diet, you can subtract those dietary fibers from your total carb intake to see how much energy your body can actually get from that food. Good. Questions? All right, so the difference between simple and refined carbohydrates is simply that refined means it's processed. So simple carbohydrates are something you can go out in nature and find, but refined carbohydrates are something that we've taken, like sugar cane, and turned it into white sugar or brown sugar by adding molasses to it and things of that nature. So if you have high fructose corn syrup and you have all of these other refined sugars, that's what, or processed sugars, that's what makes up something refined. Even with that, with candies, powdered sugars and stuff like that, those aren't necessarily inherently bad for you. It's just that they add up very fast. They aren't necessarily satiating, meaning they don't necessarily make you full, and you have a really, really, really high reward effect from that. So whenever you consume food, your body has a hormonal response. It releases dopamine, it releases serotonin, and that's what gives you the pleasurable feeling from food. It rewards you hormonally from food. That, to your behavior, makes you more evident to want that food more, to crave that food more. So when it comes to sugary foods, and we usually add sugar to a lot of fatty foods on top of that, it's non-satiating, so we eat a lot more without ever feeling full, and our body craves it more, wants it more, so therefore we seek it out more, and therein lies the problem, right? Or at least part of the problem. So it's not that they're bad, but they're bad in excess. Now, to the earlier number that you calculated, your TDEE, this is how you would use carbs if you wanted to further refine how much you should intake for carbohydrates depending on what you want to do. Generally, you want to have about 40 to 65% of your total intake come from carbohydrates. Now, that may seem shocking to those that are trying to cut out carbs altogether, right? Because that's already close to and above half, but 40 to 65% of your intake should come from carbohydrates because it is your body's primary energy intake. The more active you are, the more carbs you need, especially if you're more inclined to doing cardiovascular and aerobic activity, because those have an even higher carbohydrate demand. So if you're a runner, swimmer, biker, and especially those that do that for long durations, then your carbohydrate demand is significantly higher than someone that's in the weight room that may do a set for 30 or 40 seconds, rest for a minute to minute and a half, and do another set for 30 to 40 seconds, right? That interval type training still uses carbs, but at a much lower amount than you will if you're doing consistent exercise. Okay. What does a highlighted portion say?
Minimum biological requirements.
Yeah, 50 to 100 grams per day. This comes back to your brain. This is how much energy your brain needs just to operate every day. And the more critical thinking and creative thinking you have to do, the more complex cognitive processes you have to be able to endure, the higher your demand. So if you look at this from an energy perspective, right, how many calories are per gram for carbohydrates? What did it say on the chart earlier? How many calories per gram? 4. So if you look at the minimum, you need at least 200 to 400 calories just at a very, very, very bare minimum just for your brain per day. Now, I'm going to tell you that most of us, with our op tempo here with work, are already far past that per day. So this is where it becomes potentially detrimental when your soldiers are trying to severely cut carbohydrates, and then we have a critical mission going on. Or they're trying to do IWQ, and they're trying to react to something that they don't normally do in their day-to-day life because they only get to shoot maybe once a year, right? Or they're trying to go through boards, they're in AT, and it's something completely different from their normal occupational demands. In these periods, they need a lot more carbohydrates in order to maintain that cognitive process. What we typically see with individuals that are on a long ketogenic diet, where they're trying to stay in low in carbs, is they actually have a lot of people call it like a foggy brain syndrome, right? Where your thoughts seem a little bit slower because you don't have the energy to be able to manage a lot of those processes when you're in a low carb state. Yes, exactly. Now, a caveat to that, on the genetic side, if you are diabetic or you are predisposed to diabetes due to your genetics, those individuals should be on the lower end of the carbohydrate intake. And this is because biologically your body is going to be less efficient than someone that isn't in that condition to be able to use carbohydrates effectively. So it is more beneficial for an individual like that to be closer to the 40%, even if they are more active, where someone that is not genetically disposed to diabetes could be closer to the 65% within that range. Any questions on carbohydrate intake? Okay, then we get to protein. So most people consider protein when they think of what? Why would you normally increase your protein?
Muscle mass.
For muscle. And that's not wrong, but it's a very small part of the picture. Most people think they only want to increase protein if they want more muscle. Now, the negative aspect to that thought process, similar to thinking of food and good or bad, as good or bad, is that you have a lot of individuals that don't lift weights, are intimidated. Exactly. So they don't consume protein as much. You have people that, whether they're older or female, or just they're not individuals that go and train in the gym often, whether they're intimidated or they feel they have some type of injury, so they're trying to stay away from weights. Even though, and we've talked about this before, reconditioning, if someone's injured, one of the primary things they need to do is what?
Work on it. I actually worked at
use weight on that area that's hurt in order to get better, right? So a lot of people are doing exactly the opposite of what they need to do. Protein is one of the most, I mean, they're all essential for the macronutrients, but it's one of the most essential macronutrients because this is the only way your body repairs itself. So the normal damage your eyes are doing, the normal damage you're doing to your bones and your joints and your muscles just from surviving and moving, the only way your body repairs that are protein. That's what's happening when you're working out. We're thinking about gaining muscle. It's just repair.
Yeah, they cut muscle and it heals, and I guess heals in place or heals muscle and
To an extent, yes. So you're basically causing damage to the fibers within your musculature. And then as your body produces collagen to repair those fibers, that all comes from amino acids, which we get from proteins. But even if you're not trying to gain mass, you should want to stay healthy and repair from injuries. A lot of people, especially older populations, a lot of people succumb to an injury and then stay in a low state of health and feel like they can't recover, partly because they're never giving their body enough of the proper nutrient they need to heal. Protein is the only one of the macronutrients your body uses for healing. This also pertains to digestion. If you think about wanting to optimize your diet, your body breaks down everything you eat using enzymes. Your body only produces that enzyme once you've consumed a food. As an example, every single food requires a different key to unlock it, which is what an enzyme is. It's as far as a catalyst with the chemical process. So if you look at lactose, right, which is found in it's found in dairy, right? So different forms of milk and cheese and stuff like that. Lactose has a very specific key to unlock the chemical chain to make that energy available, and that's called beta-galactose. That's the name of the actual enzyme. Your body won't start producing beta-galactose unless you consume lactose. It doesn't readily just keep enzymes available because they're expensive to make. Right? So it waits for the food, it makes the enzyme to break down the food. Every single one of those enzymes are amino acids. We get those amino acids from protein. So if you don't have an adequate amount of protein in your diet, not only are you not allowing for proper muscle repair and tissue repair, but you can't even properly and effectively break down most of the food that you're eating without protein. So it's not just about people that want to get big or exercise a lot. Protein is essential for everyone. Quantitatively, what we're looking at is about 0.7 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. You can make this even more specific if you were more athletic. So this is the general recommendation for everybody. However, if you were extremely active in the weight room and running out in the track and you wanted to really, really fine tune your diet, which we have an entire different block of nutrition on, then you typically want to have a greater amount of protein, but you also want to base it off of your fat-free mass, right? So your lean mass, not counting how much fat mass and the extra water that has on your body. We'll talk about those quantifiable variables in the performance nutrition class on optimizing that piece. But in general, if you stick to this, you're still going to hit everything that you need to hit. 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of body weight. Okay. Questions on this piece? So this one's actually the hardest one for most people to consume at the proper number. So if you have a soldier that's 200 pounds and you're telling him to consume 200 grams of protein, a normal 4-ounce serving of chicken, which is not a lot, but a 4-ounce serving of chicken has maybe about 22 grams. If they had, 8 ounces of that, so let's say 44 grams of protein, and they had half a cup of rice, which is about 52 grams of carbs and about 12 grams of protein. That puts them at 56 grams of protein in that meal. It would still need over 5 of those meals just to try and get to that level of protein. So this is where it becomes very difficult. This is even harder if your soldiers are vegan or vegetarian. And I never wanted to dissuade someone from being vegan or vegetarian. Those lifestyles, whether it's spiritual for them or environmental for them, are very important to them. Well, our role as a leader is to try and figure out how we can take their preferences and assist them in their nutrient consumption in order to be healthy, be at less risk of injury, without trying to fight their beliefs and their spiritual beliefs.
Supplement.
So yes, they would need to indeed supplement their diet, whether that's with vegan-based or vegetarian-based protein powders or other types of foods. right? There's certain forms of soy protein that are very, very high in amino acids, in proper amino acids and protein intake in general, that they can be able to use. But they need to be cognizant of that and aware of that. Because unfortunately, a lot of people start shifting to a vegan and vegetarian diet because they think it's healthier. And that's not the case. There's never been any form of consistent research and data showing that a vegetarian or vegan diet is healthier, but it is still very important toward the environment and spiritually. Eating meat is horrible for the environment. Bar none, terrible for the environment. I'm also not telling you don't eat meat. I love meat. But when it comes to health, it's just understanding that one isn't healthier than the other, but the constraints based on that are going to definitely change, right? So you need to make sure that they're aware of this, because a lot of vegans and vegetarians, if they're not, they're under consuming protein, and all the detriments that we talked about earlier are, expedited within their system. Okay. Now you could look up something called PNP, which stands for the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score. So Papa, Delta, Alpha, Alpha, Sierra. Papa, Delta, Charlie, Alpha, Alpha, Sierra. That resource tells you the amino acid profile of foods. It takes it from a 0 to a 1 scale. So if a food has a PNP scale of 1, it means that all of your essential amino acids, the 9 amino acids that your body can't create on its own, because there's 20 total, and your body creates about 11 of them. The other 9 you have to get through your diet. So the 9 that you have to get through your diet, if a food has a score of 1, it means it has enough of all of those amino acids to be relevant in your diet post-digestion. If you look at something where you just look at protein digestibility and protein percent, those are all based off of nitrogen content, and those studies are usually done in rats and in other creatures which aren't 100% the same for humans post-digestion. So PNP is the only score that's used internationally to show how much amino acids are available post-digestion. An example of this is if you look at rice, rice has protein in it, but it doesn't have a complete amino acid score for humans, especially post-digestion, right? Once it's cooked and once it's consumed. It's very low in certain amino acids. All vegetables, grains, nuts, seeds, everything that is not an animal protein is not a complete amino acid. Only animal proteins are complete. So in order for someone that's not consuming a lot of animal protein to get complete, they either have to supplement through different forms of powders, or they have to eat complementary foods in order to get all the amino acids they need. But if they don't know it's missing, then they can't fill that gap, right? The unknown unknowns are what usually hold us back. Questions on protein? Are these things that you don't know so far? Or some new information? Let's get to fat. Dietary fat is very important. We talked about this before. It's not only for your fat-soluble vitamins, which are what? What were your 4 fat-soluble vitamins? There you go, ADEC. So A, D, E, and K. Good. Quick check on learning there, right? So your 4 fat-soluble vitamins. On top of that, everyone in here is a tactical athlete. We all train. Now, whether we train in running or training weightlifting or train in HIIT or training calisthenics, you may have a different preference, but we all train. And our soldiers are all tactical athletes as well. You may have soldiers that are very bad tactical athletes, right? They don't get up and they don't do anything, but they're still tactical athletes because they have an occupational demand that requires certain physicalities, right? In order to be an efficient athlete, you absolutely positively need testosterone, whether you're male or female. Testosterone is a very important hormone with regards to injury repair or muscle repair in general that helps you recover from a lot of these small injuries that we introduce to our body with exercise. If less than 15% of your daily intake comes from fat, your body's going to be very, very, very suboptimal at producing testosterone. When does your body even produce testosterone? When you sleep. Perfect. Which stage of sleep? What stage of sleep?
Deep sleep.
In deep sleep, stage 3. So when you're sleeping, only if you get to deep sleep, that's when your body does physical repair. When you get into deep sleep, your body is very parasympathetic. It's one of your two parts of your autonomic nervous system. That's when your body actually starts looking at all of the information you gave it in the day. And if you gave it the information to increase its testosterone, usually through resistance training and anaerobic training, which is very anabolic in nature, right? A creation of cells, then it produces testosterone during deep sleep. And you typically go through deep sleep in the first third of your sleep cycle. So every sleep cycle is about 90 minutes. Well, when I say first third, I mean throughout your 8-hour period. So you go through a full, all 4 stages of sleep every 90 minutes. And in the first third of your relatively 7 to 10 hours of sleep is when you go through deep sleep. Right. So within that deep sleep is when your body's repairing everything in your body and it's producing testosterone. However, that's limited if you didn't introduce activity to make sure it increases testosterone. It's also limited if your body fat is too low, which happens typically in males, right? That try and keep too low of a body fat percentage. And it's also limited if you don't have good dietary intake. Right. So in order to optimize testosterone, and at least 15% of your diet from fat, and making sure you modify variables to ensure you enter deep sleep. Questions on that concept? Okay, so similar to carbohydrates, which we have complex, simple, and refined, we break fat down into unsaturated, saturated, and trans. Unsaturated fats, which are your polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats, those typically come from oils and a lot of plants that we have. Right? So if we're consuming those seeds and those nuts and oils that we derive from a lot of those seeds and nuts, those are unsaturated fats, typically polyunsaturated. Those are typically considered your heart healthy fats. Saturated fats come from animal fats, especially red meats. Right? So saturated fats are typically what increase hypertension, higher levels of cholesterol, higher levels of blood pressure, and is why when you go to see medical advice, like, hey, cut out red meat. Because it's much easier to say cut out red meat than to figure out how much red meat someone is eating, how much red meat they need, and then how much they need to modify in order to get to where they need. Right? Doctors don't typically have the luxury of having those type of consistent conversations and lengthy conversations. So in their profession, they have to revert to these small, quick sayings that they can give to give general medical advice. So you need to be cautious of that, as we said when starting the class. There's nothing inherently wrong with red meat at all. If it violates someone's spirituality, that's different, right? That's not what we're talking about. Just from a health perspective, there's nothing wrong with red meat. But an excess of saturated fat in your body can be detrimental to your health. Right? So you just need to make sure that when you're looking at your overall volume, what you're intaking. Trans fat is usually found in self-rising doughs, in fried foods, and a lot of baked goods. Now, this has been taken out more and more and more throughout the years since we've understood it. Trans fat is actually considered, it's one of the only dietary things that's considered not fit for human consumption through the FDA, which is why in 2006, between 2016 and 18, there was a huge push to remove all trans fats from foods. But the hard part is when you fry foods, especially, or a lot of the preservatives we use for self-rising doughs, the chemical process to do that, or what was I gonna get at? The process in general for processed foods, the way we do that automatically makes something trans fat. So if you look at a label and it says partially hydrogenated oils or hydrogenated oils, that food has trans fat in it. What happens is you take that fat chain, which is a fat is a very kinky chemical chain. Remember when I talked about carbohydrates, they're all carbon molecules, there's these hexagons. Fat is a very kinky chain, so it has a lot of bends to it, meaning it's very easy chemically for your body to break things off of that chain and use it. When you partially hydrogenate or hydrogenate oils, so once you heat them up and they cool down again, and hydrogen leaves and re-enters that chemical bond through equilibrium, that chemical chain becomes straighter. So you take those bonds and you make a straight bond. When that bond is straight, it takes a significant amount of energy to break it, so much so that your body typically can't process it. whether through chewing, whether through body temperature, or whether through chemicals, which are our enzymes and our hydrochloric acid in our stomach and that kind of stuff. So your body can't break down trans fat, which leads to it building up in your arteries, building up as plaque, and causing different forms of negative biological effects. So that's why trans fat is seen as not fit for human consumption, and we need to be wary of those foods. Okay. Questions? All right, so fat should make up approximately 20 to 30% of your TDEE, but your minimum is about 15%. 15%. Yep. Correct. 15% is your minimum threshold to have optimal testosterone production during stage 3 of sleep. So the way you treat all of these numbers, right, pulling everything together for the initial question by Sergeant Coley, you first calculate your TDEE and help your soldiers calculate that. Then you start to obviously apply purpose to it. But then we have to break down the macronutrient intake so they can modify their dietary patterns to what they like as well as what they need. What we don't need to do is say, you need to eat fruits, you don't need to eat fast food and red meat, you need to eat this, don't eat this. That is a very, very, very ineffective approach, particularly because we can't ensure the soldiers can keep up with that pattern. And auto-regulation is the most important thing. Consistency, as you brought up earlier, is the most important thing. So what we need to do is figure out what they like to eat. What constraints do they have? All right, if they're lactose intolerant and they are allergic to pine nuts or certain things, right, we can't just give them rudimentary and general advice. We have to modify what they can eat to what they like to eat. So we see what they like to eat, then we help them find out how much they're supposed to be eating as part of it. Absolutely. And then what is the composition of the foods they like to eat? If they normally like eating plantains and rice, then they need to see how much plantains and rice do you like eating and what is that composition? If you took that and you put that in a plate, what are the amount of fat, carbohydrates, and protein in what you normally like eating? Now that they become more aware of what they're constantly consuming, maybe it's just cutting out a fourth, a third, or half of certain parts of that, and they can eat exactly what they normally like eating, increase their pattern of eating it at regular intervals, and then they can start actually meeting the goals they want, and they didn't have to make any type of drastic change. A lot of people can't stick with these dietary fads because it doesn't fit their patterns, their habits. They think, oh, let me just eat salads and drink water. Let me just do this and that. They're not enjoying it. And eventually it becomes bland. There's no reward effect from it hormonally. And so they can't stick with it, meaning it's not going to do anything for them in the long run. So we could take exactly what they like to eat and just modify it. And it's much easier than most of your soldiers may think. The average person only goes through about 4 different types of meals in a year. They may have 1 or 2 types of protein that they just cook in different ways, right? And then maybe 2 or 3 different types of vegetables that you cook in different ways. Yeah, so if you just look at how they say they like chicken and they like tilapia, right? Or they like salmon, whatever it is. And they like, again, plantains, maybe avocados and rice. And they just really change the seasoning and change the composition. Maybe it's baked this time, maybe it's air fried this time. It's still the same food. So if they can figure out the macronutrient intake of their food and they get to visualize what that is, now, once they have that and they've patterned it, they never have to weigh their food again. They never have to count their food again because they've learned their pattern and now they just have to keep up with it and be consistent with it. Yes, I like to, that seafood diet, right? You seafood and eat it, right? So I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. But what I want you to be cautious of is initially we should start with the numbers with our soldiers, as well as provide the purpose. But as soon as your soldiers start showing a good pattern, get them away from counting calories, get them away from counting macros. It seems contradictory to the initial intent, but a lot of people may find it so tedious that when they can't keep up with the number game, they just stop everything altogether. So they think if they can't do one, they're not going to do everything. Instead, we need to get them to understand the why and the how, and then get them away from all the tedious processes. That way they can maintain it longer. Good. Questions on that? Good. So once they know kind of the composition of the foods they like, remember all of those macros that we just went over have ranges. So one person may love eating carbs. Perfect. Just make sure that your percentage of carbs are higher. And if your percentage of carbs are higher, what's going to happen to your other macros? They're going to be lower because all of them should equate to 100% making up your TDEE. So if you increase something, they just have to know they're going to have to decrease something else. That's all it is. It's a give and take. If they're more active, then their energy demands are going to change. If they want to lose fat, then their energy demands are going to change, right? Because if right now their TDEE at 180 pounds comes out to 2,200 kilocalories, but they want to weigh 145 pounds, then eating that weight at 180 pounds isn't going to put them at 150 pounds or whatever, right? They need to make sure they do the equation based off of the composition that they want. That way their body sees the energy availability, right? The amount of energy that is regularly available to them, and it will start modifying its composition to match the energy availability. Everyone see that point? Good. All right. So this is the last primary slide on macros we're going to talk about. As it comes to water. So your body, everyone's body is about 50 to 70% water. Most of us are around the 70%. The more, depending on your composition and your hormonal processes, you're going to hold on to more or less water. Okay. But this is almost everything that you see when you step on a scale. So if your soldier steps on that scale and they're like, hey, I'm 210 pounds today. I want to be 180 pounds. What are some of the negative aspects of their current understanding of weight that you should think about to talk about with them? Most of their weight's based on water. Good. What else? Say this, that person feels they were young, they used to be able to see their abs. Not that having abs is important. And let me make that clear right now. Having a six-pack isn't a good measure of being healthy or being fit at all. You can be fit, healthy, and have a six-pack, but having a six-pack doesn't mean you're healthy whatsoever, okay? I want to put that as a disclaimer. But let's say to the person's individual goal, they want to have a six-pack, right? And they see themselves as having a lot more fat in their abdomen, and they think they want to lose 30 pounds. What could be a negative correlation between that thought?
They think eating less versus they probably just think like basically starving themselves to feel like, hey, listen, if I don't eat, my body will look like.
Exactly. They may think that I weigh a lot, so I need to eat less to weigh less to see a six-pack. Oh, that's another critical piece. Thank you. They may start focusing on a lot of abdominal exercises and trying to do too much training, but not focusing on the nutrition aspect, right? So one, can you target fat loss? No. Doing exercises for a certain part of your body won't make you lose fat in that part of your body. Arm exercises don't make you lose fat in your arms. Abdominal exercises don't make you lose fat in your abs. That's not how it works. Your body genetically adds or fills fat cells and deplete fat cells depending on, well, again, genetics, without being redundant. And then the information you give it will either tell it to fill or to deplete. That's it. But the misconception is that most of the time, the look that people want, the number on the scale will either not change or the number on the scale may go up. Because that number on the scale is relatively, it's irrelevant. Right, is what I'm trying to get at. Typically, if someone loses a lot of fat mass and they lose a lot of water with it, they're also losing muscle when they're losing fat mass. Because if they're giving their body the information to lose mass, it's not very specific. It's not just going to lose fat. right? It'll lose a little bit of both, and it happens. It's okay. But if you start to try and get lean, like people think they want to look, that thinner or tighter look, most of the time that means actually gaining muscle. Gaining muscle doesn't mean getting big. That's hard, and it takes years and a huge process to get big. You have to force feed yourself to get big through muscle and do a lot of other things. Okay, so you can't just get big. But if they want to actually look lean, the cultural aspect of what looks sexy and looks good, most of the time they will actually weigh more or maintain the same weight. And this is because muscle it doesn't weigh more than fat, right? A pound's a pound, but muscle is denser than fat. So the leaner they are, the more that weight on the scale may go up. So from a behavioral standpoint, we need to make sure that we can use the weight on the scale as a tracking metric, but not as the goal. Because the weight on the scale is typically going to give them a detrimental piece, right? It's a negative behavioral process if they're just focusing the weight on the scale. It may actually reinforce bad behaviors because they may not see that number on the scale changing as fast as they want. And then that may make them drop everything altogether. Right, so instead they should be measuring their body composition, such as tape. If they have a tape test, they could buy tape, they could buy calipers and learn how to do it. And they don't have to do the Army tape test. You can look online, there's 9-point tape tests, which you may tape the bicep and the thigh and the neck and the chest. And that way they can look in the mirror and they can look at their numbers and see, is their form of training and is their form of dietary practice actually affecting their composition the way they want it to change? Okay. Second piece of that is consistency. It takes a long time to make change. You never actually want quick fat loss and quick weight loss. That's a very, very detrimental thing to your health and to your performance. Never want that to be fast. Okay. I know I talked about all of this with water, but I usually say it because water is the thing that they see change a lot. The average person's body weight will change between 8 and 11 pounds per morning and evening just based on the water alone. We get a lot of our water from food, and then our salt intake and our hormonal intake will change how much we're storing water. Depending on your activity, your environmental variables, and how much salt you're intaking, your body will increase or decrease a hormone called aldosterone. And aldosterone will tell your body to hold on to water, which usually makes you feel bloated, especially if you have more inflammation in your gut, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that'll change weight on the scale, but that's irrelevant because it's just water. It doesn't mean you're fatter. It doesn't mean you actually lost weight. If someone sees that they've lost like 5 or 6 pounds in like 3 days, it was water. You didn't lose 5 or 6 pounds of fat and muscle in a few days. It didn't happen. Okay. The last piece I'll say on water is this. Once you start feeling thirsty, you're at 1% dehydration. Once you hit 2% dehydration, you can have up to a 70% loss of cognitive function and physical performance. So for us, and especially that we work in austere environments as tactical athletes, that's very critical. Sergeant Coley brought up earlier, especially in the Caribbean, we're working out here in hot temperatures. We're setting up tents. We're doing things. We're sweating. We're talking a lot like I'm doing now. Every single bit of this is using water. So as I start to get thirsty and I'm reaching this, once I start hitting 2% dehydration and more, my ability to react and to be effective is extremely low. So we need to make sure our soldiers are consuming enough water, not too much, right? Because that can cause hyponatremia, but you want to make sure they're consuming adequate water. Questions on water? It is. All right, this is what we're going to close it out on these 3 questions. So this is an open forum, and I'm going to try and end every block of instruction that I can, every kind of lesson with this type of open forum. So I want you to look at these and think for a bit, and we'll get into a quick discussion for these last 10 minutes for these questions. Right? Reflect on how can you best inform your soldiers of efficient dietary practices, or what steps our command teams can take to implement better nutrition programs in our unit. And then what are your potential next steps in addressing these issues within your unit? So think about it for a bit. As soon as you feel you haven't answered any of these questions, just bring it up.
The most important part is exactly what we're doing here. Just try to help them understand that before they come up with a plan to do whatever they want to do, they have to understand the bodies, not only their body composition, but also, like we said, we mentioned earlier, the type of activity they perform every day, whether they're more sedentary or not. Once they understand how their body works in relation to what they do, then they can come up with, okay, so I want to maybe cut body fat. What do I have to do in order to?
Good.
once they understand that, then they can come up with their own plan. They don't even need, oh, they may, but it'll be easier for them to understand what they have to do in order to, get to their goals.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the education is key, right? For us as leaders, providing the purpose behind a lot of this information. And it's generally not provided, which is why we see so many of our soldiers, one of the reasons why we see so many of our soldiers struggle with weight loss and with their overall composition and performance. Really good point.
So, like, what steps can our command team take to better
Mhm.
program? So for us, I would say getting you and other people that deal with the steps up on a regular daily basis, come to units, speaking with them about that, and then following through with it. Another part would say, even with the nutritional plan that we eat for lunch, like a lot of the cooks say they prepare food in that area or whatnot, but even with knowing that, like some of the portions I've seen in our area, like, I mean, it's a big old plate of everything that you get. And the soldiers are seeing this as an option to eat, so they'll go ahead and eat all what's there, not realizing it's too much for them to have. And what like as a trainer and the training is here, like what are we putting in to those daily activities for our soldiers?
Absolutely.
Things that they need and that nutrition would be helpful for them, getting all those calories, but they're just sitting in the classroom by PowerPoint, they're not spending anything. So that's what I would say as far as implementing performance nutrition programs, what our command teams can look into for those days and weeks that we have.
Perfect.
And I was looking at what are the next steps, like addressing dietary education. Like I mentioned earlier, just more of the information piece. It also goes into the assessment and the actual leader knowing their soldier and their goals.
Very good.
They can go about it as far as in assessing the soldier, having a conversation with the soldier. A previous clinic that you had before, like we have the GAT training, but nobody actually look at the GAT. They deal with
very important.
But a lot of information goes into it as far as in what your soldier is eating, how much does he eat of it, what his exercise is. A lot of it can come from the actual results. So I think it more comes with just actually giving the information, and then, like I said, knowing the soldier and their actual goal, where they're trying to get to.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Senator Gomez?
And the second step, taking more of like giving the information to every soldier, like practicing by squad instead of being like, hey, if you're wrong, you need this. Like inform every soldier and make it a practice, like a habit in the squad, so everyone can complement each other. Like maybe you can take for the first step, like the team leaders, and educate them and have them practice with the squad, like, hey, let's calculate this and let's see what we can do to eat better and get better nutrition.
You hit one of the most important pieces. That is critical. Critical is so, thank you very much for that. It's very valuable. If we don't train the leaders, and if the leaders don't hold their soldiers accountable, we can't establish the patterns and the behaviors, which is we started this very block of instruction with, if we don't change the patterns and behaviors, everything else falls by the wayside. So I completely agree with you, Senator Gomez. You're absolutely right, which means we need to teach them how to fish, right? We need to teach the platoon sergeants enough. You can teach everyone, but the first sergeant should hold the platoon sergeants accountable, or the DET NCO. And then those individuals hold the section leaders and squad leaders responsible, which hold the team leaders responsible with regular practice. So good. So in your battle assemblies, when you have section time, your squad time that you should be having every battle assembly, maybe an hour per, these are conversations your squad leaders and team leaders can be having with their squads and teams, right? Reinforcing, calculating some of their energy demands, rechecking the individual's goals, their progress, right? 2 months ago, when we did your initial counseling, you said that you wanted to be here, and you gave me your plan of action when we calculated your nutrients of getting here. Where are you at with that? Are you having any challenges with it? Right? So we try and prevent our soldiers from thinking battle assembly is battle assembly. When it's done, I'll focus on the next one. Because this information that we're providing with H2F and with CTAS are things that they can take home and do in their everyday life. Right? It's not just setting up a certain piece of equipment that they have or what they can do in uniform. We're trying to increase their quality of life and understanding, which means our leaders need to reinforce this and check on them more often as well. So that's very good. Anything else you want to add, John Garza?
Just I'll keep it short. Just be the example.
Oh, good.
Example
Perfect, perfect. Thank you on that. Anything you want to add?
Would just like train the whole unit with this, like, so they can kind of understand what information, and now then I would have to stay sharp and like have their soldiers set a goal and then counsel them to like have it on written down, and they keep checking up on them and see what's going on with their diets and stuff.
Perfect, perfect. So we need to educate our soldiers. And if you don't feel up to that right now, that's fine. That's what this is for, to help prepare you to do it. In the meantime, I'm your resource for that. And please utilize the Teams channel, utilize our CTAS SharePoint to be able to pull the nutrition classes and the additional things to be able to help you. I've made nutrition flyers and training flyers that are easy to be able to post around and to be able to send to your soldiers digitally that allows them to help calculate a lot of this and go over some of the initial myths. From a command team perspective, we need to implement our policies. A really good point Sergeant Coley brought up that I didn't even think of is the fact that if your soldiers go through the dining facility right now, our portion size is modified based on the soldier. No, so you may have a 120-pound soldier and a 220-pound soldier getting the same exact portion size on their plate, right? So maybe it needs to be implemented through the leadership aspect of allowing the soldier, once they're educated, of course, because we're not going to restrict what they're eating on their point. That's still an individual's decision, but we may need to be able to allow the soldier, if that conversation isn't happening right now, to be able to communicate with that cook, right? That other soldier on how much, maybe the cook needs to reinforce the question of how much of this do you want, right? So we can actually start modifying the volume properly. And the next steps is, a lot of you brought up a good practice, exactly that, implementing counseling, implementing leadership and empowering leaders to have these conversations with their soldiers so that we can be consistent with tracking that information. Wonderful. So that's going to conclude today's lesson on fueling the body for nutrition. Our next class on Thursday is going to go over the Iron Soldier Assessment, right? The ISA, which is going to be the best warrior competition program for our brigade. That's going to start Q1 of next FY. Right, so we're less than 6 months, just shy, less of 6 months before every unit needs to start this. Not to start preparing for it in 6 months, but to start this, which means that you need to be able to pull those brigade policies for ISA and be familiar with it. Make sure your first sergeant and your company commander, your platoon sergeant, and your squad leaders all have a copy of it and they've read it, so they can start thinking about how they can help their soldiers prepare for this. So as starting October 1st, we can start hitting the ground running. Okay, if you have questions on it, you can let me know. Of course, the next class is specifically to go over detail on it and how we can address this within our unit. Okay. So I thank you again for being here and taking the time, and I will see you on Thursday. Thank you very much.
For